Hello and welcome to this lecture on Adobe Photoshop by Eduonix Technologies. In this lecture we're going to be taking a look at brushes, so open a new file. It can be any settings really. And go ahead and just open your brush here. And as you see, you have a couple different kinds of brushes. But we're just going to be using the regular brush for this tutorial. Now, you can open this brush panel by hitting F5. And you can tie it in right over here, which is often a good place for it if you like to collapse your menu. We'll get into that in just a second. And if you have a Wacom pen that has all these different sensitivities in it, you probably already know how to use that aspect of this panel, although this can be kept open for quick, easy editing. But your brush is going to paint whatever is in the foreground color. And right now I'm using a brush of 0 hardness and 5 size. So let's switch it to a bigger so you can see. And you'll see the hardness in terms of the scattery edge of the brush. That's just there to tell you that you're using a soft brush without having to look every time. Now, as you can see, that is a hardness of 0. I'm going to set the hardness to 50. You can also use your mouse wheel on these to set them, and you can, I believe, control click and move it like this to do that really fast. And that's true with about everything in Photoshop. So let's set it to 50 and go right next to it. As you can see, it uses more of the circle, and we're also at an opacity of 80. So these two 80s on top of each other actually makes an opacity of 96, in case you're counting. So let's set this to 100, and as you can imagine, you get this line with it. Now I'm going to set the opacity to 100, and just like before, you can see that you have a bunch of little circles basically as you're making this line, and that is something that's going to get on your nerves. You can affect that in brush tip shape with F5. You press F5 to get this up. So I currently have the spacing set to 25%. I'm going to set it to 12, which is a good standard. And now keep in mind, the lower you go, the more memory and processor usage it will take up. So your computer might lag if you go too low, but 12 is a pretty safe bet. When you have a lot of layers, though, it'll go a lot faster. It'll go a lot slower, should I say. Now I'm using a mouse, so it's a little bit jagged, but you can see that those annoying little circles aren't there anymore. Just like if you want a cool dotted line, you can see it in the preview here. You can paint a dotted line in Photoshop, and you can do anything that you want when you figure out how all the tools work together. For example, in transfer or color dynamics. And I encourage you to look at each of these on your own, because we're not going to have enough time to go into each one of them. You can create different effects. If you have pressure and you set this to pressure, and you have a more colorful brush, you can set your foreground and background to 2 different colors. Set the foreground background jitter up, and you can get all these different dot effects. And this is set to fade at the moment, but there's a little bit of randomness involved. But if you have pen pressure, a light pen stroke will create the blues, and a heavy pen stroke will create the reds. And I encourage you to look at each of these settings on your own, just to play with them. Some of them might be kind of hard to discern what they do, but there's too many to really go into. Just know that each one of these affects it, and I'll go into each one and what they do. Shape dynamics determines the shape of the brush. The size is mainly used if you have pen pressure, size jitter. Minimum diameter and all this stuff is used for pen pressure. If you set the minimum diameter to 90, you're only going to have a 10% change in the pen pressure. So it'll start out with about 90% of the circle and it'll go to maximum pressure at 100%. And you probably already know what that means if you're using a pen. The angle jitter is something you can set to initial direction, for example. And if I set this up to, of course this would have to be a round brush or a oval brush, and I think I have one. Now you get to this panel by hitting the right click on your mouse. Same with if you have a pen, you have a right click button on the pen. And these 4D brushes can only pretty much work with Wacom pens and a few other ones, a very select few other ones, and they take up an enormous amount of memory and processor speed, mostly processor speed. So just keep that in mind when you're using these. Once again, this is something you probably know about if you're using a Wacom pen, and we do have a Wacom tutorial coming up, so it'll be covered in that. But let's go back to this normal pen here. As you can see, a solid color is very fast filling in the screen. I have a pretty small canvas. But let's just take a look at the rest of these. Shape dynamics, you can alter the shape. Scattering is a little bit more useful if you're not using a pen. As you can see in the little preview down there, that's basically going to tell you what the brush does. If I hit X, it'll switch my foreground and background color. Just keep that in mind, because it's pretty useful. If I make my scatter really wide, I can create a pretty cool effect. Now if you have this set to pen pressure, you can do some pretty wild stuff. So that's with my scatter wide. I can set my count to more, or I can set my count to very few, or all the way down, which it is all the way down. Now, texture will apply a secondary texture to whatever you're doing. So in this one it looks like I have some kind of a canvas texture. And you select the texture right here. Once again, you can also select blending mode. And you can select different things like scale, brightness, and contrast. Scale is how big the texture is. It's hard to see with this example. We're going to turn scattering off so it's a little bit easier to see. I'm going to increase my brush size too. So if we alter scale, you can see that it makes the texture bigger as we go, and you can just look at that brush preview. So brightness will increase the relative brightness and decrease it accordingly. But let's go to a big scale so you can see the difference. So if you just want a subtle texture in a brush, this can accomplish it with a selection mode. It's a very useful tool. As you can see what the settings I have to accomplish what I just did. Contrast is also pretty cool. I can put in some sharper, more defined bits of texture. And you see, just with one single brush, we can create an enormous amount of different selections. You combine this with the selection video. And of course, I would have had to have done this on different layers. But you combine this with the selection video and you can get these great selections, and you can do a lot with that. So back to our brushes. That is what texture does, and texture is really useful. And that was only one texture we took a look at. So I'm going to hit B to go back into my brushes, the shortcut key B. And as with all shortcut keys, if you shift and press B, you'll shift in between the different options you have in the brush tool over here. But back to this, we won't really have time to go into the mixer brush, which I was just on. So that's texture, very useful. As you can imagine, dual brush is not that useful, but it's good to have if you're making some brushes ahead of time and you just want a double brush. Basically, it just puts a brush on top of your brush and it averages them out. So right now I have like a scattery kind of brush on top of my regular brush. If I make it this thing, you can see if I change it to this teardrop shape, which leaves a bunch of teardrops, I can make the spacing really wide too. This has all the basic brush tip shape options for your second brush. So I can paint some leaves. You know, I'm using a very high spacing, 172%, and I picked a leaf pattern. And remember, you can always see what you're doing right down here. So going down to color dynamics, you saw how that can change, and if you have pressure, it makes it pretty wild. And transfers is probably the second or third most important one. With transfer, you can have an opacity jitter that with a light pen pressure, it looks something like this. And as you go harder pen pressure, you get deeper opacity. Now, I'm not using a pen, but as you can imagine, if you have a pen, this is very useful. And it will appear in this little preview as very light over here, to fading to dark, to fading to light again. I do miss my pen. If we go to brush pose, this is more for 40 brushes, and it conforms to your tilt. This is pretty much if you have a Wacom pen. We'll go to noise though. Noise is kind of like texture. And when you have noise, you can see the edges don't have the same kind of dithering as you do normally. The clean dithering. So you're basically getting rid of your dithering. Now wet edges will have a higher opacity towards the edges. It'll also kind of create an effect that's very useful. You can set your magic wand to select just the inside and then leave the edge, so it kind of is good for creating outlines. I hardly ever use it really though. Buildup is an interesting one. If we set our opacity to 1, which is affecting the flow right now, this basically just turns on buildup effects. Smoothing is something you would pretty much have always on. And then protect texture. Protect texture applies the same pattern and stroke to all the brush. Its default is off. Might as well just keep it there. So we're going to go more into brushes in the next video, but right now we've gone into all these different brush capabilities, and this is essentially what makes a brush. If I right click and I go to, let's say, this leaf brush, you can see things changing over here. As I cycle through the brushes, you can quickly see, just with having this F5 command, brush open, also located in window under brush, just by having this open, so let's take a look up at the options panel, which as you know pops up for every tool you have. When we're in the brushes, we can see they're pretty useful over here. Now some of them you won't use because you can just go to right click, like brush type. This is where you select your brush. It's not really useful. You can go to right click for that. And here we have the brush panel, which is F5 shortcut key. And as you can see, we have that set up normally. And remember, if you want this to stay up, when you click on something, you have to set that in the preferences panel and edit preferences. it would be interface, I think, or one of these. I think interface. Auto collapse. So I have mine set to off so that my brush panel stays up because I'm going to be going into this a lot. Anyway, that's that. These two. Pretty much you can do them with shortcuts. And the same, here we have, you can select with all these different kinds. These are settings that basically affect these over here. I never use them. On mode, this is very, very cool. Here, you can set a blending mode on your actual stroke, which means that once you paint it down, it'll be rasterized into the layer. If I select lighter color, and you can mouse wheel through these, once you have the blue rectangle around it. As you can see, when I start painting, the blue rectangle goes away. I can do hard light. I can do anything on here. It's particularly useful when you have patterns or a transfer brush selected, or basically when you're painting with the clone stamp. A lot of other reasons. It's just if you want this to be, I use it for color a lot. If I'm coloring something, and let's just say this is the item that I want to color, so I would pick a brush, and you can check this out in blending modes. I'll set it to color, and let's say I want to color it whatever this color I'm going to pick is, green, and opacity to 30, and another brush type right here. I can paint over it and it'll eventually change the color to green. Pretty useful for coloring, very useful. If you don't want to use layers or if you're doing something really quick. Anyway, opacity also very, very, very useful. I have it set to 30, as you can see. In color, you can subtly color something. If I have it set to hard light, you can subtly use the hard light command, which isn't very subtle, so I usually have that set to something like 30. But I usually don't use this. I'll just do another layer with the blending mode on it. But just so you know, you can do it to your actual pixels that you're laying down. So that's opacity too. And here we have always use pressure for opacity. When off, brush presets control pressure. So right now, because I'm not using whack and pen, I have that set to off. And I can go affect my pressure in brush presets. Now they call it opacity. In brush presets it's called transfer. And you can see opacity under that. Over here we have flow, very useful if you're using a mouse and don't have a Wacom pen or a similar pressure sensitive pen. If I set my flow to 9, my opacity to 100, you can see as I lay down my color, it's not fully opaque. If I set this to 100, it lays it down fully opaque right away. I'm going to clear my board off. So let's set this to about 50, which it should be on default. And I can paint fast strokes, or I can just build up. Really not much you can get out of 50, but when you set it to like something like 12, I can paint fast. You can go basically over your stroke while you still have the mouse button held in. So if I'm painting a sphere, I basically would fill in my sphere. Well, I'd basically fill in my sphere really quickly and then go towards the bottom of it. So you might even want to set yours to something a little bit higher, or lower I should say. Something like 5, and then just take your time. Make a circle, fill it in like a spiral. And then just spend a lot of heavy time on the bottom. It's really hard to use. I don't use it. I'm used to pressure. But that's what flow does. Basically, with flow set to 5, you're only laying down 5% opacity. And each time you go over it, you're putting another 5% on it. It's kind of like just if you went like this. Click, click, click. I'm releasing every time. Except you don't have to release your mouse. It's a lot more useful than the way I just described it. And then here we have enable airbrush style buildup effects. very similar to flow. If I just hover this over, you can see the circles get smaller. I can do tiny little dots with just a click, and by continuing to hold in the button, it goes like that. Where if I don't have this selected, I'm holding in the button. As you can see, very useful if you don't have pressure sensitivity. And the very last one over here is always use pressure for size. When off, brush presets control size. Same thing basically as this over here. And if you have pressure sensitive, it could be a tablet too. It might not necessarily be the pen itself. But if you have a capacitive touchscreen, pressure sensitive Wacom tablet, you'll be using all of these commands. So I encourage you to get one and to really go through your brush presets. Now you can get them for about $100 on Amazon. Really nice. I suggest an Intuos 4 or an Intuos 5 if you're trying to save some money. Don't worry about the Cintiqs. You don't really need one. And as anybody will tell you, you can use a very basic Intuos, and you'll get the hang of it really quickly, and it'll feel just like you're painting right on the screen. I highly recommend it. So that's all for this video, and check out our next video on brushes, as we'll go into some more of the advanced features of brushes as well as brush